Good day, everyone, and welcome. My name is Tim Harty. I'm Mondac's Chief Executive, and it is a big pleasure to welcome you today to the second of our exciting 2023 Future Series events in partnership with Bennett Jones and the Canadian Corporate Counsel Association. I'm thrilled to open today's webinar on powering up legal considerations in the electric vehicle life cycle from raw materials to infrastructure. We're joined by a wonderful panel, and it's a big pleasure to introduce you to our moderator today, Mona Eganian. Mona is the Director of Strategy and Programs with the Ontario Vehicle Innovation Network, also known as OVIN, the Government of Ontario's flagship initiative on the future of automotive and mobility. Mona received her Bachelor of Engineering, Chemical Engineering from Western University and her MBA from Richard Ivey School of Business. Mona has an extensive background in strategy development, technology transformation, and data insights. And prior to working at OCI, she worked in the financial services and in industrial manufacturing sectors. Before I hand you over to Mona, a quick housekeeping item. You'll have the opportunity to submit questions to today's presenters by typing them into the questions pane of the control panel. Please send your questions privately to the organizers only. Thank you, and we'll get to as many of them as possible during the Q&A session towards the end of today's webinar. At this point in time, I'm going to hand you over to your moderator today. Mona, over to you.
Thank you so much for that intro, Tim, and thank you everyone for joining today's event. It's my absolute pleasure to be here today to moderate what is sure to be a very enlightening panel. So as we all know, the automotive industry is undergoing a monumental shift to the production of electric vehicles. The electric vehicle market has been experiencing rapid growth. Auto companies are making significant investments in electric vehicle production. Charging infrastructure is expanding globally. On top of that, governments around the world are implementing policies and incentives to support the transition to zero-emission vehicles. So with this momentum, we have to consider the supply chain that will support this transition. And there are a lot of legal and regulatory things we need to think about. And this is where our panelists come in. They've worked in the field, they've seen all the issues, and they're here to share their real-world insights. So let's meet our panelists. I'll start with Michael Smith. So Michael has been working with the automotive industry throughout his 25-year legal career, both in private practice and in-house at General Motors of Canada Company, and as acting general counsel and government and regulatory affairs with Volkswagen Group Canada. I doubt there are any legal issues facing the automotive industry that Michael hasn't dealt with. For instance, Michael was intimately involved in the site selection process for Volkswagen's AG battery subsidiary, PowerCo SE, first North American battery manufacturing plant to be located in St. Thomas, Ontario. And he continues to work on that project with the Bennett Jones team in the procurement and construction phase. It is the largest automotive investment in Canadian history and one that we were involved with here at OVIN. Welcome, Michael. Sander Grieve is the head of the mining group at Bennett Jones. He practices public markets, M&A, and finance, working with issuers, investors, and boards of mining companies. He's a frequent commentator on issues pertinent to the mining sector. Welcome, Sander. And last but not least, based in Vancouver, Duncan McPherson is a corporate commercial lawyer with the Energy Group at Bennett Jones and recently completed the McGill University HEC Montreal Executive MBA. Duncan advises on new projects and transactions across the spectrum of Canadian energy. In the EV space, Duncan helps clients establish, maintain, and grow their charging networks. Welcome, Duncan. Thank you all for being here today, and we're truly excited to delve into the topic and learn from your experience and expertise. So Dan, if you could switch the slide, please. So I'm going to start with you, Michael, and ask, are we really transitioning to zero-emission vehicles? Is it just a fad, or is it here for the long term?
Yeah, the transition to ZEVs, particularly battery electric vehicles, is now, I believe, inevitable. Most OEMs are now all in, having made massive investments in the transition and made long-term plans. And many governments are now regulating the complete transition of new vehicles from ICE or internal combustion engine vehicles to zero emission vehicles by 2035. There will be countervailing socio-political forces, but in my view, they will not be significant enough to reverse that transition. And this is especially true once we reach a critical point in the transition, which is likely in the latter half of this decade. Once there is a prevalence of ZEVs in the market's naturally going to respond to lower demand by pulling away some of the current benefits of operating an ICE vehicle. For instance, gas stations won't be as prevalent. Neither will automotive technicians with ICE experience. And I think you're going to see the differential in the cost of operation between an ICE vehicle and an electric vehicle continue to grow. Even before we reach that critical point where we've got kind of a shift in the supply and demand curves, OEMs are not going to reverse course on the massive investments in long-term planning, and their customer preferences are shifting towards EVs in any event. So I think we may have reached or may soon reach the point of no return.
Okay, and next slide, please, Dan. So is it fair to say we've got it all figured out now? We can all go home?
No, we're certainly not saying that the transition is not without issues and unknowns. One of those issues is the transition and build out of production capacity. You've got a 100-plus-year-old industry that's been making internal combustion engine vehicles throughout its life, and that's an industry that's on product cycles of about 5 years, and that needs to be retooled. And when I talk about product cycles, I mean that it takes about 5 years from the design of a new vehicle to the start of production. So there's a long lead in planning for product cycles, and OEMs have already committed to transitioning towards EVs and working now to build out that production capacity. Sandra, did you have anything to add to the issues that we might be dealing with?
I did. Thanks, Michael. I think one of the exciting ones is the build out of supply chains for the materials to make this transition possible, especially battery materials and recycling of battery materials. Mining and recycling are going to be two industries that are a huge focus through the next cycle for business in this area, and we can see it now with new entrants into mining conferences. We've been meeting with and speaking with the proponents of electric vehicles for some time around mining conferences. They are now a new stream and a real meaningful stream at the conferences to identify supply, looking for projects that are looking for offtake agreements, looking at projects where there are opportunities for near-term development, and even looking at opportunities that are on the exploration side to prepare a chain of materials to meet future demand.
How about you, Duncan?
I'll add some energy thoughts in the mix. I think that the EV transition is already being felt on the energy front. The Canada Energy Regulator just released their Canada Energy Future 2023 report, their projections for the future, and it says that if the world achieves net zero by 2050, or indeed even if just Canada pursues and achieves net zero by 2050, we're looking at end-use electricity in 2050 in the range of 39 to 41%, compared to 17% of end use in 2021. And so, going from 17% to 41%, that's obviously a massive increase. And what that means in practice is the need for much more generation. That generation to achieve net zero will arguably will be renewables, which means wind or solar, which raises challenges with intermittency and the need for energy storage. Equally, rolling out EVs in a very massive way, as is government policy to have 100% of new vehicles as ZEVs by 2035, means that you're going to see a lot more charging in our individual neighborhoods, in our streets, and that's going to affect grids in more congested areas. And so there's going to be a need for a lot of investment in grids. Adding to the complexity of the picture is that the technology on the EV side is evolving. So, for example, bidirectional charging is technology that we haven't seen yet in Canada, but could be a game changer. That would allow cars to both be charged, but also be a source of electricity. Essentially mobile energy storage, which is really cool when you think about it. It's like, you know, all these massive batteries in cars being used as a form of energy storage. That hasn't really, to my knowledge, that hasn't had an immediate impact on the energy sector yet in Canada, but it surely will. And we need to be thinking ahead, and in our contracts, we need to be planning ahead for what could be some massive shifts in the overall technological picture in the coming years.
Yeah, so it sounds like there are a number of issues, with some of them also coming with opportunities. Are there any other issues that we're facing as this transition is happening? And that's for all of you.
Yeah, well, charger network build out, I think, is perhaps the most significant issue for adoption. You know, we need to get charging to be as convenient as the typical consumer experiences with gas stations these days before you're going to be able to achieve that 100% adoption. So it's particularly in Canada, I think that the speed with which we can build out the charging network coast to coast to coast will be a significant factor in whether we're successful in this transition to EVs or not.
I think another area, you know, frankly, beyond where I practice, but labor, skills, and immigration are going to be huge opportunities. The sorts of skills that are needed for this transition and the labor force that are needed for this transition are not necessarily what we're producing today. So they're, you know, to the extent that we have a STEM push on in the public school system leading into the university system, I expect that to intensify. I expect an intensification around the recruiting of people into mining engineering programs. That has been a challenge over the last number of years, and I expect that policymakers will be further trying to bridge that gulf through not only through domestic supply, but also through immigration and the point system of encouraging those people to find a future in Canada if they're interested in and active in those industries.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to add as well that with new opportunities comes disruption, and you know there will be sectors of the labor force that are more traditionally tied to internal combustion engines, and there are going to be disruption in those sectors as well. Fewer opportunities and a impetus for retraining in the ZEV revolution.
Absolutely, a lot to think about. It's there are a lot of different angles to think about here. So next slide, please, Jan. So let's talk about some of the legal issues, kind of where the lawyers come in. So Michael, maybe we can start with you. What are some of the legal issues associated with the ZEV transition? And Jan, if you could switch the slide, please, that'd be great.
Yeah, the legal issues really cover the landscape. The list is on the screen. You know, mergers and acquisitions, JV issues, regulatory issues, contract issues with consumers, between businesses, privacy issues, which, you know, privacy issues affect almost everything these days, trade issues, IP issues, product liability, labor and employment, tax. Then you get into the sort of quasi-legal issues. So we've got government development, government policy development and implementation. You've got government incentives for capital projects and production on the producer side. You've got consumer incentives on the EV purchase side. There's, you know, geopolitical evaluation and risk and site selection for the capital projects and the sourcing of raw materials that we indicated was going to be needed to retool the industry from ICE to ZEV, and also to source the raw materials that are needed for the new vehicle components, batteries and motors in particular, and indigenous issues.
So a lot of legal issues at hand. And so let's start discussing some of those. Sander, let's go to you. How is this transition to ZEVs likely to affect M&A and joint venture work?
Sorry, M&A joint venture work, I expect to be very busy. We've started to see the onset of investments directly from OEMs into mining companies to secure supply. We expect that to intensify with them getting involved in earlier stage mining enterprises, with them seeing that as a gateway to off-taking relationships in order to be around the table to assist with development decisions and prioritize development of those companies. If you assume away magical solutions to where we are on a very shallow supply curve. Supply and demand become increasingly mismatched through the course of this decade in most battery commodities. And you should anticipate that there will be considerable investment in that regard to ensure that those raw materials are available to meet demand. Capital flows are going to follow business climate. We're seeing that now with announcements from the federal government to revisit how mining projects are approved, with a particular focus on critical minerals development projects. They want to be around the table to figure out how to streamline that process. We think that's an important part of seeing that investment come to Canada and ensuring that the raw materials are available to meet demand. We're seeing real success in incentivizing development. The critical minerals tax credit regime is drawing investment into Canada. We are seeing people spend money in the ground on the exploration and development that is crucial in this space with that encouragement. So that has been a really exciting development. We expect there is going to be a need for more creativity to drive more development. The business climate continues to, in our minds, not completely reflect the transition that we're seeing from a policy point of view. From a policy point of view, as we've talked about, we're pretty clear where we're headed over the next decade and a half. We continue to have a mismatch in commodity values and commodity availability compared with the anticipated demand. So we expect that's going to drive investment decisions and drive government support into encouraging those investment decisions. Infrastructure is going to be a key piece. That's one the mining sector talks about constantly. The projects that are most likely to meet this demand are typically not adjacent to large urban centers. They require considerable infrastructure investment, and that is a place where government has found a seat at the table traditionally. We've seen some encouraging developments that way. If you go back 2 federal budgets, you see greater than $2 billion set for infrastructure development over the next 4 years with a focus on critical minerals. This should be seen as very encouraging to industry. It is a drop in the bucket compared with the need. The announced 4-year commitment would almost cover building the road to the Ring of Fire if that project was approved. So that gives you an idea of scale. We're going to need to do that 10 or 20 times over before we start to make a dent in where we're headed here. But it is progress. It's the right direction.
That's great. Michael mentioned regulatory issues. So Duncan, from your perspective, what do you see as the key regulatory issues in your space?
I'll speak to what I'm seeing on the charger network level. There's myriad regulatory issues when you think about adding electrical generation, and we can talk about that in addition. But I think from our charging network clients, a lot of it right now is really focusing on the detail of compliance, for instance, setting themselves up contractually to be able to take advantage of the new federal clean fuel regulations and the ability to trade compliance credits created through EV charging infrastructure deployment. And so that is, I think, front and center for a lot of clients. they're, those regulations are quite detailed, and so getting the right rules and the right description of the relationships in the contracts done correctly is important. Other issues we're seeing is the pricing strategy, questions that have arisen now that Measurement Canada has authorized through a temporary dispensation power energy use charging as opposed to time of use. And so now there's the possibility of having one or the other at fast chargers, and I think that's shaping strategy on pricing. There's really lots happening on the regulatory front, although not my primary of expertise, on real estate development and on the siting of charger stations. So for instance, BC, which is really trying to encourage charging station deployment in multi-use buildings, in new builds, has for instance changed the law around strata construction and condominium buildings in BC, so that existing owners only need to have a 50% vote in favor of installing charging stations as opposed to the prior threshold of 75%. So trying to make it easier for existing condos to add charging infrastructure. I think those are the main ones.
Great, thank you. What about you, Michael? What do you see on the regulatory horizon?
Well, I mentioned ZEV mandates. Governments in the US and Canada really mandating that new vehicles are zero emission vehicles by 2035, with a ramp up curve between now and then. I'm hopeful that the governments will continue to monitor how we're doing on that curve, and potentially adjust the mandates accordingly. In my view, the industry is clearly acting in good faith, well on the road to zero emission vehicle transition, as I mentioned before. But there are a lot of unknowns and some things outside of the industry's control, charging network development and build out being one of them. So I'm hopeful that we've got this ambitious goal now, but it will be adjusted to what's realistic and reasonable as time goes on. We've got ZEV purchase incentives, a fair patchwork of those purchase incentives that are available to consumers throughout Canada. We're lagging behind the United States with respect to purchase incentives. You've got government incentive programs, really for the infrastructure, the charging network build out, but also the capital projects and production capacity increases, both in set programs and ad hoc programs as well. You may see regulation around battery recycling, although I am hopeful that governments will understand that may not be necessary, because OEMs very much see battery recycling, end-of-life recycling, as a key contributor to the flow of raw materials that will be needed to build the first generation and many generations to come of zero emission vehicles. Harmonization is an important topic in North America. The regulatory regime for automotive is very well harmonized between Canada and the United States. That is critically important for the North American vehicle market, and governments must be very careful not to mess with that. Right to repair is an issue that comes up often. Mandating that OEMs make available to independent auto shops the same information that they make available to their dealerships for the repair of vehicles. In Canada, we have a voluntary agreement that's been very successful that makes that information available on a voluntary basis. So I would hope that governments in Canada at least understand that regulation in that space is not required, but there have been bills before Parliament on the right to repair topic. technician regulation, you know, you're going to see a need for a change in skills in auto technicians between internal combustion vehicles to electric vehicles. Right now, in most, if not all, provinces, EV certifications or certificates that are offered to automotive technicians are on a voluntary basis only. They're not required. I think you'll likely see some regulation in that space. Those are some thoughts off the top of my head, Mona.
No, that's great. Obviously, a lot of legal issues on the whole, but just from a regulatory perspective, it seems like there's just so much to think about. And so can you speak to that in terms of that regulatory burden?
Yeah, I mean, what we have to understand is that new regulations mean more regulatory burden to the regulatee, so industry in this case. And ultimately, and what that means at the end of the day is dollars and cents. More regulation means more administrative burden on OEMs, and ultimately much, if not all, of that cost is passed on to consumers. And the automotive industry is highly regulated. And so we really do have to focus on cost benefit analysis when we're looking at new regulations from a government perspective. At the same time, though, there is likely less regulation that's required in the zero emission vehicle space than there has been traditionally in the internal combustion engine space. Think vehicle emissions, for instance. Very complex, complicated regulatory regime that really spanned engineering, chemistry, and law. When you transition to zero emission vehicles, that's not required anymore. So I'm hopeful that the net benefit of the transition to zero emission vehicles is less regulatory burden and therefore cost savings to ultimate consumers.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. So let's talk about trade.
Mona, can I jump in?
Of course.
I think it's such a important and fascinating topic, which is, and probably a question that will dominate EV development in the years ahead, which is what needs to be regulated, what doesn't need to be regulated. And just what came to mind is in BC, we actually have a very interesting example of deregulation in a sense where the BCUC, the British Columbia Utilities Commission, ran an inquiry. I'm going to simplify this, but in essence, there was an argument that EV charging could have been a utility type service that should have been rate regulated. And in the end, it was determined that that isn't necessary for charging, and that a market-based competitive approach is suitable in the EV charging space. And as a result of that, we see in BC, where we've got, I think, the leading EV adoption in the country. So you do see a lot of EVs on the roads here, a very competitive charging space with many different players, from public organizations like BC Hydro through to energy companies like Parkland and Petro-Canada Suncor, and pure charging network deployers like ChargePoint, and of course Electrify Canada. They're all here, and they're all competing, and they're all building out their networks. And the question will, I think, be in the future, is that sufficient? Does that get us the density of charging network that we need? How much will be left for the government? And is there a need for regulation in the future? I'm going to go out on a limb here, and I'm sort of betting on the competitive model, but there may be exceptions to that.
Right. Yeah, I guess it's to be determined at this point. But it's interesting to see the approach that different jurisdictions are taking and kind of what lessons we can glean from that. So why don't we talk about trade now? And Sander, I'm going to go over to you. Any thoughts on trade?
The trade has been a particularly exciting area. When you look at what's going on for our friends who practice in the area of Investment Canada Act approvals and national security reviews. The critical mineral space has been a place where you've seen some very exciting developments. It is very important to all of us in this transition. Canada has been a net beneficiary of inbound foreign investment in relation to most of our large projects that have been completed in Canada. We are a relatively small capital markets player in the world, but a large piece of geography, so we tend to rely on that external help. The Investment Canada decisions recently, the orders that came out to divest lithium projects, sent a very clear message about investment that is welcome in the Canadian capital markets. It has raised a challenge around the space of participants in those capital markets wondering, if certain people and certain investments are unwelcome for whatever competitive reason or otherwise, what fills the gap? What is the strategy to fill the gap for those investments, for those projects to be successful in this competitive landscape? So we've done a good job at picking our friends, but we need to maybe tell industry and the proponents of these projects a little more clearly how we're going to help them to find new friends or more diverse group of friends, or incent others in order to participate in developing those projects. We have had particularly interesting developments where you see the U.S. Department of Defense, publicly saying that we are looking at investments in the critical minerals sector, and laying out the welcome mat to look at those. That is is something that has gone on for a long time, but has not been as publicly broadcast as it is recently. And I think the rest of the West is going to have to decide how to accommodate that, whether they bandwagon to participate with that sort of development to ensure a seat at the table. We also have new questions being asked of whether some of these commodities have such a scarcity around them that we should anticipate that we're going to see export controls used at some stage in order to ensure that domestic supply is protected over the exporting of some of these products. So there's lots of great issues around this right now, and things that are critical to industry for they and their council and policymakers to work their way through.
Yeah, I'll jump in here too on trade. I mean, with USMCA and the Inflation Reduction Act, we're seeing that trade issues aren't just duty issues anymore. We're seeing more and more that incentives are being tied to rules of origin in order to incentivize onshoring of production. So in the U.S., Inflation Reduction Act benefits for production of EV components. The production has to be done in the United States to qualify. You're seeing the purchase incentives that are being offered to consumers being tied to the origin of the vehicles themselves, with automakers with the U.S. presidents benefiting from that, and those without being left out of the incentive game, and the consumers of those brands not being able to qualify for the incentives. I think we may see more of that in this space, up and down the supply chain.
Right. Anything to add, Duncan? Wonderful. So Duncan, back to you. Michael had mentioned contracts as one of the legal issues. Any thoughts on that?
I think as a solicitor, one of the interesting aspects of contracts in this space is that it does involve the integration of a lot of players on different projects. So if you think about like a charging network, you have the car manufacturers who have to be involved in terms of the technology and making the cars compatible with the chargers. You have charging station site owners who are sometimes different, sometimes the same as the charging station operators. Charging station operators will have contracts by way of usually digital terms with the drivers who are charging. And of course, you've got the power companies that are providing the power. And so you do get some very complex and interesting, what I'll call matrices of contracts, often in different forms, because the power company will have their own form and the manufacturer of the charging station will have their own form. So trying to get the chain of risk right for the particular client, where you can't really back-to-back terms because there's different forms of contracts, is, I think, a challenge, and requires a lot of thought on these types of contractual projects that we work on. The other aspect I'll just mention briefly is integrating different technologies is a trend we're seeing. So, for instance, at charging stations, combining, you may have local solar power to provide power to the charging station. You may have battery storage to provide backup or other power to the charging station. So integrating not just charging, but other energy technologies is a prevalent challenge as well, and one we enjoy working on.
Fantastic. So we've touched on a number of legal issues here on our list, but there are a few others. So we've got IP, product liability, labor and employment tax. Opening it up to our panelists, any thoughts on any of these additional legal issues which we haven't touched on?
If I can kick it off with First Nations participation, this has been a really exciting area and is quite topical today. There was just an announcement today from Electra Battery Metals, which is a metals recycling business that the Three Fires First Nations group has entered into a $20 million partnership with them. So that is an exciting example of direct participation. And it's really, I think, a harbinger of things to come, where we're going to see true partnership in the businesses around this sector.
Yeah, I totally agree. Tremendous opportunities in the clean energy transition writ large for economic development partnerships with First Nations groups.
Yeah, that's great to see.
Yeah, I'll pick product liability, another area that I'm very familiar with. Just generally speaking, with new technologies come new product liability risks, and some of which are foreseeable right now, others may not be, but safety around the development of new technologies is always first and foremost. But we will see new types of product liability risks coming out of the EV transition, just generally speaking.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say legal firms have entire departments dedicated to this kind of issue around product liability, just related to this kind of technology. So it's certainly a shift. Yeah,
a shift, yes, because as we move away from ICE vehicles have their own liability risks that are not shared by EVs. So we will see some product liability risks go away, and potentially others grow up.
Yeah. So I'm seeing some questions from the audience starting to trickle in. So I'm going to give our panelists maybe another 5 minutes to share any other thoughts on any of these legal issues, and maybe any closing words before we start getting into the crux of the questions that our audience does have. So keep your questions coming in, and I'll turn it back to the panelists.
In tax incentives, I think, is another area. We touched on it briefly, that there have been tax incentives around critical minerals development. There have been tax incentives around vehicle sales and support for those. I expect that's going to intensify. That the critical minerals tax credit is the beginning of a process to drive investment decisions into that space. As I mentioned, there's a high degree of suspicion that we're not yet seeing market forces reflect commodity prices as they should be, given the supply-demand imperatives that are in this space. And one of the ways that you solve that, if you think that's a problem and you're a policymaker, is through using tax tools to incent development. The other related piece that I think we're going to see around that will be interesting to watch will be the prioritization of investment in those spaces. We have a lot of public or quasi-public pension funds and other large players in the economy, and I expect there will be some incentives coming at some point for them to participate in this transition and provide some of the means to make that possible, and to be part of that solving of the gap in the resources coming to this space. As we've seen some, SOEs, for example, requested not to participate as vigorously in this space as, let's say, they have in the past.
I'll share an additional thought around charging stations and their deployment in the competitive market, which is that the overall impression I have is that the rates of return on charging station operations themselves are relatively low. And so that may be a bit of a barrier to the type of deployment we would want to see for widespread EV adoption. So I think something that will be really interesting to follow is to see how players increase, perhaps indirectly, the rates of return on charging infrastructure, for instance, on the power marketing side, or in terms of how charging stations are deployed in the retail space and the services space to really take that 15 or 45 minutes of dwell time that drivers need to charge at fast charging stations and turn that into a value proposition.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for covering those issues. Obviously, a lot to think about. So we've got about 15 minutes left before the end of this panel, and I'd like to give the audience an opportunity to ask questions of you all. So I'm going to jump right into the questions I've been seeing. So the first question is from Lisa. We were talking about, obviously, Duncan, earlier we were talking about bidirectional charging, and she was asking, is this an opportunity for another element of sharing economy, i.e. renting out my home car charger?
It's a very interesting question. I haven't heard of that yet, but never say never. I think the sharing economy, and as it relates to cars, is a very interesting topic in and of itself. One thing I can mention just anecdotally, in Vancouver, I think we're the first municipality here to approve on-street charging from your home. So there's a bylaw that allows you to basically run a cable, only a level 1 charger. I don't think you can use it for level 2, but across the sidewalk. So many of us park on the street in Vancouver, and so having a charging point at home is challenging if you don't have a garage. Anyways, the city has allowed this. You can now run a cable and charge your car in front. So that may promote some sort of sharing insofar as your neighbor might be able to, park and use your corridor. There's lots of possibilities.
Yeah, it's an interesting notion, and I think a lot of these ideas are born out of technology developments, and it'll be interesting to see kind of where things head with the sharing economy and charging. Bradley's sent in some questions around investment. So I know we're talking a lot about investment, particularly in Canada. So this question is kind of a two-parter. So the first part is, do the speakers believe that a significant large-scale project will ever be built in Canada again? And if so, on what is the strength of that mechanism to see that continued investment here in Canada?
Sorry, you go ahead with a sector-specific project, and I'll go ahead with the supply chain. I'll follow you with the supply chain project.
Yeah, well, I'm having a little bit of trouble understanding the question, so you go ahead, Sandra, because that might tip me off.
Okay. I firmly believe that we'll see large-scale projects built in this country. We continue to host a lot of resources that are very important for the development of this industry and for this transition to take place. There are fanciful notions that you see out there of, we'll just recycle it all. We can't recycle it all. Like you look at the copper, for example, over the last 10,000 years, 70% of the copper that we have mined over those 10,000 years is still in use somewhere. We have a very efficient recycling system. We've been at it for a long time, due in part to scarcity. And then due in part to our increasing use of it, and our use of it only increases then again eightfold when you go from an ICE to an OEM. So copper is going to be an issue. I believe firmly if the right copper projects are brought to market, that there is going to be widespread support for those, that there's going to be an ability to marshal public support for the development of those projects, and that there will be willing participants from governments and host communities to make those happen. I'm a little more skittish when it comes to where the capital is going to come from, but we do have a long history of being able to dedicate that to those projects as a society, and a robust economy in North America that's committed to making this happen. So I firmly believe that we'll be able to make it happen. I share what I think is the skepticism coming from the questioner, that we have had a recent trend of trying to make it really hard to do projects here, but I firmly believe that Canadians will find it in themselves to again do projects in Canada. And you can see it from the federal government on down, of talking about and wanting to talk directly about how do we expedite permitting for projects. And I think that's we got to take in that the sign that there's an acknowledgement broadly that we've got to get behind this, and that it's crucial to making this transition.
So if I can just jump in with another piece of that question. So permitting is one thing, but obviously we're kind of talking about how some government subsidies are required, so similar to what Volkswagen received. So Bradley's also wondering how much public money will be required to support this transition, and he's looking for a number.
Don't have the answer to that. It's not a question of government money being needed for the transition. It's a matter of governments competing with one another to attract that investment. So at the largest scale, the availability of government incentives is less about, will that manufacturing be built? It's more about where.
And so, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to be unhelpful. More than a shoebox. We really don't know. I think we should expect that will decline over time, right? At the leading edge of these things, there's an anticipation that you're going to be reaching beyond pure market factors, and you're going to need some jump starting at some point. If this transition takes hold, if everybody's driving an OEM, we're going to have to find a way to make the batteries for the next generation of those OEMs. So or EVs, I should say. Then it makes it very clear that we're going to have to get to a market economy on this. So that should be a declining number, but on the leading edge, requires a bit of jumpstart.
And presumably that investment attraction, there's kind of a plan behind that. Like, for example, when we're establishing this new battery plant, that's going to create a lot of jobs, right? And that's good for our economy. So I'm thinking that that's kind of where those investments are kind of focused on. It's not just, it's more of a long-term thing.
Just to add on the electricity front, we are starting to see there have been major projects in Canada. There will continue to be major projects, and British Columbia just announced a new power call for the number 8, 3,000 gigawatt hours to be deployed by 2029, and that's through a public but competitive procurement process that will ultimately be backed by the ratepayers in BC. So there's sort of a sense that investment costs will be absorbed publicly, and that's a lot of new power.
So question from Rustam, he's asking, how can the industry convince the feds to align with the ZEV mandates and with the US, and invest in charging infrastructures to support the adoption of EVs?
You know, good advocacy with governments is driven by facts and figures. So studies, comparison with the US, results-based analysis in both jurisdictions. You know, I think that's how you move the needle on regulatory design and implementation.
Lewis is asking, it would be great if you could talk about the international supply chain and global sources of raw materials.
Yeah, the international supply chain is fascinating. So you know, when you look at the critical minerals list, a lot of the critical minerals come down to a sole supplier. Refined critical minerals in a number of categories run greater than 80% from China. So, you know, that creates an imperative around a lot of these critical minerals of being able to develop multi-channel supply, or accepting that you know, you're under dealing into a market in which you have very little market power and are dealing with a market dominant player. So I think we should anticipate that there's going to be continued work to find alternative sources. I think you see it when you see the competitive investment condition around the world, when you see some of the headlines in the newspapers recently about takeover bids and offers for corporations. You can draw a direct line to the accelerating tension around the control of the supply of critical minerals. And the next piece you should be watching for as an investor and a citizen is control of the refining of critical minerals, because that will be the next crucial piece that has to be harnessed in order to have the supply.
And what about sustainability? How are companies starting to think about that?
Yeah, it's a massive driver. The auto industry almost entirely is looking at sustainability, ESG metrics as a key decision point when looking at where to source. I was going to say raw materials, but it's really along the entire supply chain. So that will, I believe, continue to drive sourcing decisions at OEMs.
Yeah, it's an interesting notion. I mean, we say ZEVs are better for the environment, but what's the impact if we're not responsible in terms of how we operate our supply chains around it?
Yeah, and the cleanliness of the electrons that go into batteries as well. You know, the environmental impact of a ZEV on a clean electricity grid is, you know, much higher than it is on in a jurisdiction that is using, you know, burning coal in order to generate electricity. So you do have to do that full life cycle analysis of the products and how they're being used.
Absolutely. So we've got about 5 more minutes. We've got a few more questions. And on the subject of electricity, Tony asks, has anyone seen a responsible projection of electricity availability and costs? He says it's a loaded question.
I can take a shot at this. It's a hugely important question, and I haven't been around long enough to see how projections have turned out over the 30, 45-year time frame that we need to be thinking about to get to 2050. My impression is that certainly in British Columbia, BC Hydro is very dialed into electricity needs, and there's an elaborate regulatory process to test that. In neighboring Alberta, there's a competitive market for electricity, and the companies involved in that space are, of course, keenly interested in understanding the demand and meeting that demand. So I would say I think certainly the capacity is there to try and get these predictions as close as possible. But at the end of the day, and this is a theme throughout energy, supply and demand and matching those two things is fundamentally very difficult. And that's when business opportunities arise. and also when business challenges are created when supply exceeds demand.
I get Tony's vibe. I think if you look up demand and supply for copper or nickel as you come into this piece and anticipated demand requirements through electrification of transportation, the only chart that's probably more stark is the required investment in generation and transmission facilities in order to make this possible. So we got a lot of work to do, which is exciting if you're on the leading edge of helping people to develop those projects and mitigate the risks of them and work in new and burgeoning industries.
Absolutely. Love the attitude, Sander. A question from Shalom. He or she wants to know, in Canada, does the design of the Clean Energy and Clean Technology Tax Incentive compete with the Inflation Reduction Act in the US?
You want to take that one, Duncan?
I will, not my area of expertise. However, my impression is that the government of Canada is keen to see that compete. And my impression is that Ottawa is very alive to the risks of not competing in that front.
Yeah, and I haven't done the math, but my strong suspicion is that it's designed to be competitive. Is it dollar for dollar competitive? Absolutely not. It's something, and I think will be useful, and will achieve its objectives somewhat. But I think the net benefits available under the Inflation Reduction Act are higher.
Perfect. I think we've got time for one more question, and this one comes from Catherine. And I know our panelists were talking about this prior to the panel starting, but there's a recent set of announcements from Ford and GM agreeing to use Tesla charging connectors and thereby providing charging access to Tesla's network. So she's asking, do you see a need to tamp down fragmentation of the charging standards and make things harder for consumers, or will this be like Betamax versus VHS wars?
Are you going first, or am I?
I was going to say, Mike, I'll look at it. Yeah, no, I'll go first briefly, which is just the thing. I don't have a good answer to that question. I think it's an extremely pertinent and timely question, but it does speak to one of the myriad of factors that will ripple across and have impacts on the types of contracts we're working on. You can see significant technological shifts from day to day with the GM and Ford announcement. So great question, and I think something we'll all be noodling on.
Yeah, I from my perspective, anything that increases charger access for consumers is a good thing. Either there will have to be standardization in connector or interoperability available from chargers and charger ports on vehicles. One of those two things will naturally happen over time. But I see it as a success. Anything that we can do to increase the availability of charging for folks wanting to jump on the EV bandwagon, and you will have to jump on it by 2035. That's a good thing.
Perfect. I'm going to leave it at that because we are at time. So this is a really dynamic, engaging discussion. We've touched on a lot of issues. So I've personally learned a lot. I'm sure our audience has as well. So thank you, Mike, Sander, Duncan, for your time, expertise, and contribution to the discussion. And thank you to our audience for your participation. And I'm going to hand it back to Tim to close us out.
Great, thank you. Huge thanks to our moderator and to our speakers today. That was fascinating. Some great questions from the audience too. Finally, on behalf of MONDAC, the Canadian Corporate Counsel Association, and Bennett Jones, thank you for joining us. Thank you for your time, and have a great day.